Welcome to Lines and Spaces,
My name's Michaela.
and I'm Jason,
This is where we talk about music education.
and all things cool in music. So I first want to start off by saying thank you to everybody who watched our first podcast. It was surprisingly successful. Not saying that we didn't think it was going to be, but we got a lot of great comments on it, and I think people really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for that. And today we're going to be focusing on the topics of 21st century skills and learners in general. So thinking about more of a student-oriented idea rather than the educator itself. And on to throw you a question, Michaela. Just in general, in music, as you were growing up, whenever in the public school system that you went through, what was 21st century learning to you? Like, what was the 21st century classroom for your development?
Well, um, I think a pretty good description of the beginning of my education, especially in the area of technology, we started learning how to type technically in computer lab in elementary school, and I don't know what exactly happened, but we kind of stopped. We never assessed on it or anything. We kind of got the bare minimum we needed to continue, and now I can type. And since then, we had access to laptops and things like that. In certain classes, they'd bring laptops in. You got the little Chromebooks. Um, and the further along I got in my time in public school, the more we used technology in the classroom, and more so, it it was it was necessary that we had technology at home to complete assignments and to do research and to really get the fullness of the education that was being presented to us. So that's kind of what it was like for the technology aspect of the 21st century, which I think is a huge part of what we talk about for the future of education and really where we are in education. Other than that, I definitely had a good mix of types of teaching, I think, as a student. I had teachers who liked to lecture. I had teachers who were a little more hands-on. There were definitely different modalities coming from different classes and different teachers and their preferences.
Yeah,
How
I
about you,
completely.
Jason?
Oh yes, I also completely agree with that. It was kind of weird. I think we're in like I think our generation is in this weird state where we've had technology basically our entire lives. We had some form of technology, not necessarily that we had smartphones right away. Because
Yeah.
I remember having a flip phone or like a
Yeah.
sliding phone,
The
had
slide.
like it had like a face of keys on it, which is my first phone. But thinking back, yeah, through like same with you, as like time progressed, I realized that more technology was being integrated into the classroom. Like, we had like a keyboard lab, I think in fourth and fifth grade, and before that, we just had books and not really any access to like a laptop or any type of computer. Which nowadays thinking back, I don't know how I survived, but yeah, it was like a really big like shift in that direction where as we progressed through our primary school and secondary school education, that technology started getting more and more integrated into the classroom. Because I remember, I think it was my sophomore year of high school, one of my classes had like a room assigned laptops that were just mine. Like I didn't get to keep one when I went home, but they gave it to me for that class, and only my data was on that laptop.
Wow.
So because we only used that for that one class itself, which is a humanities class for 2 periods, which was interesting because it was like a piece of technology that I got to interact with every single day. And instead of bringing out textbooks for that class, we walked in, grabbed our laptops, put it down, logged in, and we got on Google Classroom, and everything was kind of there. Our assignments and everything were already there, which
Wow.
I think it really that really helped in just thinking about like how technology can like organize things and how we can basically just have all of our stuff in one place without the need of like having multiple textbooks or notebooks, which is what a lot of my earlier education was having textbooks and taking notes in
Yeah.
notebooks. So yeah, I agree with you that it was the 21st century music classroom has changed even within our I think our 12 years
Yeah.
within public school.
Yeah. I actually have one more note to add to that, just something that is kind of amusing now, I guess. I don't think I'm really very old, because I'm not. But when I was in high school, we actually had a program. We had an iPad program, which was testing the effectiveness of iPads in the classroom, and they just took like a small like focus group
Oh.
every year. I think it was like sophomore class, like just a handful of students, they would have do their classes with iPads. And we're so like we're on the way now to the point where that's going to be the norm, and I feel that's going to age me when I say they were
Oh
testing
yeah, that was.
when
Oh
I
yeah,
was
because I think
in
the class that I took was that same idea. Like our class had it just because our district was thinking about
yeah,
purchasing a bunch of these things, but they needed to see the effectiveness of it. And
yeah,
now that you're talking about it, I think my school district, especially with COVID and everything, they kind of gave everybody that needed it laptops, which is just insane to me because back then it was like such a luxury to have a laptop, and nowadays they're just like giving them out,
it was
which
so
I've
exciting.
yeah, and of course, this falls within the characters of our districts, which we come from suburban
Right.
areas, which usually
Yeah.
have the funding to be able to do so.
Yeah.
But thinking from like an urban perspective, I'm sure that they definitely still have access to technology, but definitely to probably a different degree than we had,
Yeah, definitely.
which I think is great because with the cost of technology going down, the access to getting technology in the classroom, even for underfunded school districts, has gone up. Like the availability to be able to do so, because
Yeah.
I definitely do think that technology and the impact of technology is the defining factor of 21st century like classroom or like learning practices.
Yeah.
But I want to talk more just because we went over the whole idea of what this progression looks like through technology, but thinking from like a teaching subject, you had mentioned a little bit about different modalities of teaching and how some teachers, like you said, were lecture based, some were more hands-on in their teaching, and I find that like really interesting because I also had that same differentiation where some of my teachers kind of just stuck with their roots. Like I've taught this class for the past 20 years this way, and we're gonna do the same exact thing for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
And then there's other teachers that I've met who were trying to change. They were trying to adapt. They were always asking us for feedback about how we felt, about what was going well, what wasn't going well. And I think that idea of learning through the educator side is so important because we want to make sure that we're creating an environment for our students where they can succeed, and
Yeah.
less so about how they retain information. If you want to talk more about like that idea, I don't know. I'm trying to process things.
Sure. About maybe a little bit about the ways in which we teach and the modalities of learning.
Yeah.
I know we've talked in several of our classes, Jason and I, about different approaches to education. Even so, modalities aside, you know, the modalities of visual learning or auditory or kinesthetic, just the way that the teacher approaches a lesson. There's student-centered learning, which I think Jason and I are both pretty big on student-centered, yeah, student-centered learning and teaching, where we're focused a lot on what students, not only what they're interested in learning, but kind of letting them try new ways of learning or try the ways that are going to be the most accessible to them to understand subject matter. And it's a little more about bringing the information to them instead of having them come to the information. We find a way to present it and to engage them in the music in whatever capacity we're doing that in, where they're interested and yeah, they want to engage and they're motivated to do so, which I think is the direction that 21st century music education is headed. Not to say that it hasn't been there already, but more and more that seems to be a popular way of approaching education, especially in the music world.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that idea. And one of the something that I was reading through an article about like a bunch of educators in the field talking about how they view 21st century skills and learning within the coming 21st century. The article itself was written back in I think I want to say 2011. It was about a decade ago now thinking back. And it talked about like how back then, not back then, but the focuses primarily of education itself was centered around writing, reading, and rhythmic, or the three R's that some people talk about. That's basically writing, reading, and then math were like the primary core subjects, were the focus of everything. And then it wasn't until the late 20th century and the 21st century, early 21st century, that they brought it into the idea of the four C's of education, which were collaborating, critical thinking, creating, and communicating, which I think are definitely like newer ideas that we're seeing nowadays.
Yeah,
How, like you said, student-centered learning and getting students to think critically, collaborating with each other, and being able to communicate and create. And these are only standards not within music itself, but just in the whole encapsulating 21st century like education like standards, of course,
yeah,
that we're thinking about not only students mastering content or like content knowledge, but how they're producing and synthesizing that content into a meaningful product, which I
right,
think is so important, especially with the changing times where people need to be able to think critically for themselves and fix problems through their own means and think through processes in order to get to an end result or finish a project or also communication itself is key in everything. Being able to
yeah,
communicate with others, well, others in just like different contexts, of course, and being able to like work together with individuals and being able to like collaborate and produce and create with others is so important, especially in the context of music. That's like our bread and butter is
yeah,
communicating,
yeah,
collaborating, and then creating at the end. So yeah,
yeah. And actually, so you were mentioning the importance of communication and how music is all about communication and sharing and community. Something Jason and I were talking about just before we started recording this podcast was um, kind of music education advocacy and how a lot of the time we need to find ways to advocate for why music is important to be teaching and why students should be learning it. And a lot of the time, um, we talk about it being a tool and a vehicle to other important goals, such as communication, or if a student starts picks up an instrument and starts practicing, that will help them to be more disciplined later in life, and that kind of thing, and how it just informs different ways of thinking and critical thinking. And it's interesting because when you take a step back, that's kind of what all of education is about. Um, yeah, just furthering the quality of life. And I have a quote here from a book we read our first year at Temple. Um, so it's about Pestalozzi. Pestalozzi.
I don't know the name, but I
It's
think you
pretty,
got it. But
I'm
I
pretty
think
sure he does. Yeah, so anyway, um, he believed that the purpose of education was to prepare people to achieve their highest potential at the level of their station in life, and he advocated reforms that would allow pupils to relate to education. So basically, um, it was about furthering the quality of life, and whether that is in communication or in discipline. But as Jason mentioned before, communication is huge, and it just all boils down to the same few things in education, whether it be language or mathematics. It's all about furthering the quality of life for the individuals and then for society as a whole.
yeah, no, and I definitely would agree that like the whole idea of education itself started with this idea that you had to educate the masses so that everybody can be brought up into a like hopefully equal level of like everybody can communicate and there's this structure that we as individuals can communicate with one another because we are thinking critically, we are consuming information and processing information so that we can communicate in meaningful ways and hopefully progress society through that means into a better and brighter future for everybody, which is I think what the ground root of what education stems from, especially public education. And yeah, and especially in the 21st century, we're talking about reading this article that we read from Eunice Boardman, which talked about which was written back in October of 1992, before the turn of the century, talking about what the 21st century classroom was going to look like, primarily in the context of music, but it relates still even just in general. And they talk about the student population. We're thinking about inclusion. We're thinking about diversity because, as we know, the classroom in general not everybody in that classroom, especially nowadays, is gonna look like or think like you. That you have to accommodate for different backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, and you have to make sure that all those types of different cultures and different diverse peoples are being able to succeed in the same context as everybody else. And then they also talk about diversity in different subjects. So we're thinking about, in the context of music, you're thinking about music diversity, like what world music outside of the Western canon that we primarily talk about can be brought into your classroom to possibly enhance students' experiences with the world itself and world music, and then of course incorporating new technologies, and then this of knowledge of how and knowledge of. So we're thinking about knowledge of diverse music of learners, and then knowledge how of making music and the music curriculum, that we have to like think through like how am I doing it and of what reason am I doing it? What we
Mhm.
have to critically think about. Am I teaching a subject and what am I trying to get out of this subject or inform my students of when I teach this subject?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important just thinking through from a teaching perspective because you want to make sure that every topic that you're touching on is related in a meaningful, hopefully related in a meaningful way when you engage with students in it. And yeah, so that's like the nutshell of like that we're trying to 21st century students are gonna be hopefully are going to be taught in a way of like a as a global citizen, basically, is I think that's what getting towards.
Yeah.
Is this idea that students have to be, but outside of thinking critically and, having skills that work in the 21st century workplace, they have to be able to interact with people from around the world. Because as we get more interconnected, we can't just think about what our like our own community at home is. We had to think about how can I communicate like globally? Like how can I be a global citizen outside of the context of my local community, outside of my country itself, and
Mhm.
connecting the entire world? Because that's the direction we're headed in. Where technology makes it so that we can interact with people from around the world in like a split second we can be
Yeah.
connected with somebody. And I think as crazy as that is, we as individuals, as teachers as well, have to teach our students about this idea that we have a global identity, that you have to think
Mhm.
beyond just what you're doing, you have to think about what the world is doing.
Yeah, and like one of the beautiful things about music by itself is it can be such um, an equalizer and even more so a mode of connection, and that's something that can be accessed for anybody who's interested in accessing it. There's even movements of music for people who are hard of hearing and who are deaf. So music is something that can bring all people together from all walks of life with all kinds of different ideas. And that's one of the beautiful things and one of the things that makes it so important to continue to educate people on music, and something that's actually been a shift recently, which I know Jason's recently done a lot of research on some of our goals as music educators. And there's been, I guess, a shift from the performance aspect, which I think we touched on in our last episode,
Hmm.
to lifelong music learners is more what we're aiming for when we're teaching students about music, how to engage in music. So it's becoming more of, I guess, an integrated piece of life. Music in itself is part of more aspects of our lives, and yeah, different ways of communicating. It's just a little bit more in everything we do.
I completely agree with that. And let's talk. Well, I know that we were talking about the general context of education by itself, and we slowly started getting into the music classroom itself. And like Michaela said, the idea of communicating and well, from last episode, why we teach music is because of communication and how, like Michaela said, music is like this great equalizer that anybody can interact with it at whatever degree. Like you just listening to music or sharing music from different places, it doesn't have to be from like world music in general or any music within your community, that itself is interacting with music. You have, in fact, you have interacted with music, and that is a form of music education and response that you have done that and you're sharing that music, and other people that like that music may communicate with you like, oh, that's a really cool piece or that's a really cool song, have you listened to this? And we're constantly sharing music back and forth, and that's like that equalizer that everybody listens to music, everybody interacts with music in some way, shape, or form outside of what we commonly view as performing or creating music. That it's like this thing that everybody does that we don't really think about as like a way of communicating, but just loving music and being able to connect through music is the evident goal of a music education. Is getting students to be aware that there's this whole world of music out there, and how they can themselves connect with it to connect with others and communicate with others, which I think is so important.
Yeah, and I mean, just think of I don't know, 50% of rom-coms with they start off with like, oh, who's your favorite band? And that's just their instant connection, you know, music is it's everywhere and it serves all kinds of purposes, but at its core, it brings people together.
Mhm. And I want to touch on quickly just about because we talked about the classroom in general, but how about like in the terms of your music classroom? Like growing up, of course. Like what
Yeah.
oh, I'm trying to word it in a way. Like what do you think the focuses of your like public school music classroom? What do you think their goals were as from a learning perspective?
Yeah, I think obviously I remember high school better than middle and
Yeah.
elementary school. And I think that's also where there was more space to have different modalities of learning. There was just a little more time and a little more interest
Mhm.
because you chose to be in the music classes for the most part. And I know I talked about one of my music teachers in high school before, and I'm going to talk about him again, and I probably will again after this. Um, he engaged us in a lot of different types of learning. I remember a few times we had um, no talking choir classes where he would come in, he wouldn't really say a word, and whether we would just have a silent day of reflection and listening to things, or we'd go through a whole rehearsal without speaking a word and only singing. So he, looking back, I had no idea at the time, but looking back, he definitely had a lot of great ways of engaging different types of learners. We had classes where we would go back and listen to our performances. This is in choir mostly, and just to be reflecting in that way and to be actively listening. Um, I know my high school offered a music technology class, and so we were engaged in technology, or engaging technology as a tool to help us to learn. Yeah, and there were a lot of different ways of using the resources we had access to, whether it was through the school or at home. In addition to, so we had the technology aspect, and there was also that aspect of reaching out to people who learned in different ways a lot of the time.
That's really cool. I think that's like almost not completely different than what my upbringing in music was. But I'm glad that that happened for you. Like that idea that you had these different modalities of teaching and your teacher was aware of the fact that people learn differently.
Yeah,
And I think the biggest reason why I kind of stuck with music was because the modality that was primarily taught to me worked for me. And
mm-hmm.
sometimes why I think some of my other classmates ended up like dropping music or something, or pursuing other things outside of music, from an instrumental perspective, of course, like was because that they weren't able to learn through that the way in which the education was being provided
Yeah,
or shown to them, because a lot of it was reading notes, notation, and rhythms, and
yeah,
like you said, sometimes that you just can't.
yeah.
It's a
I
hard thing to do.
definitely, I would have fallen
Yeah.
through the cracks there for sure.
Yeah, and that's the biggest thing. That's the issue with a lot of education, but mainly talking in the context of music, that we can't just be teaching for how like I learned or how you learned.
Yeah,
We had to make sure that we get those students that are falling through the cracks. We had to make the content that we're teaching relatable to them,
yeah,
which is why I think it's so important that we had to have the student input. We need to ask our students how we're doing, how we can work better in the classroom, and if the stuff that we're actually teaching them is actually interesting. Because I don't
yeah.
know oh, sorry.
No, that you're.
Oh, there have been many times where I've been sitting in a rehearsal and we're just playing through music and I'm like, this is fun, I guess, but I mean, like, but I was playing music and performing music and not really interacting with the music itself.
Yeah,
Like we never did like a background on who the composer was, why they wrote the piece, blah blah, which I think are so important because if you humanize the music that you're learning, you can relate it to your students, especially in the context of world music and having this diverse classroom where everybody should be included and should feel like they're included within that musical community, that you as a teacher have to facilitate that in some way. It might not be like, asking the student, hey, what's your heritage? I'm gonna bring that in. it could be just like the subtleties, like being able to present world music in a way that it's natural and very, and of course appreciative of the source itself, because you don't want to teach a subject you don't know. You
Sure,
want to,
yeah, you definitely, and you want to be able to respect, well, everything and everyone. Actually, that's
yeah,
kind of the best statement. You just have to be respectful.
yeah,
And yeah, you definitely, as a teacher, we want we want to know as much as we can to be giving um, this information to our students. But one of the most important things about being a teacher is accepting and, well, realizing and then accepting that we don't know everything. We're not even close to knowing
yep,
everything. And a lot of the time, our students are going to teach us
yeah,
lots of different things.
yep,
And it's so important to be willing to ask for, I guess, ask for help or ask for someone to, yeah, be open to learning with you, asking your students to learn with you. And something that I also wanted to touch on that you were just talking about, the importance of teaching versus just being interested in being good at making music. It could go back to that idea of a great coach might have been an awful player, and just an all-star player could be a terrible coach. You have to know the subject matter, and equally as important, you have to be able to know how to communicate it and to reach the people you're talking to and that you're working with. And that kind of goes back to what Jason was mentioning in one of the articles we've read about knowledge of and knowledge of the content and knowing how to communicate it in
hmm
a way that's um, motivating your students to learn, because that's another important part of teaching. You're not just giving them the material, it's our job to help them to see a reason to want to know why, to
hmm
help them to understand its importance and how it connects to them.
yeah. I think I love that analogy. I wasn't even thinking about that because that is so true. That like you like from a musical perspective, there are so many great performers that we've met through our daily lives
Yeah.
that just have terrible time communicating with individuals because that well of course that's a skill that you develop through time, but it takes time to do so, and great performers don't always have those great communication skills, and those who may not be like soloists and great performers have that ability to talk and connect with individuals. I'm not saying you can't have both, of course there are individuals who can do both, but we have to think about that idea that like we ourselves we you have to strive for the goals that you want to go for,
Yeah.
basically, and also that the music classroom itself is to facilitate that growth. That
Mm-hmm.
like you said, we want to make sure that we're not just spouting information at our students, that it has to relate to them so that they're interested, like, oh, I'm gonna go home and Google this, or like I'm gonna look up this, I'm gonna listen to this. And there have been many times where my students will give me music recommendations that I will go home later and be like, that's pretty cool. Because I'm very out of date with the pop music and what is currently being listened to, and my students are not. They are very well informed with the musical happenings of the world that I have just, especially within the context that I'm still in music school, where I'm primarily surrounded with a lot of classical music and a lot of the 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 familiar repertoire that we go into, that a lot of the music that comes out nowadays just kind of falls through the cracks. Like somebody had mentioned that Taylor Swift released a new album,
She did.
and I did not know that, and I love Taylor Swift. I don't I like her music.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I listened to it with my sister. I'd recommend it.
Okay, it's called like folk tale, folk. It's some
Folklore.
folk what?
Folklore, I think.
Folklore. Okay, yeah. So that's I definitely look into that because I was like, I didn't realize this. Like there was this yeah, which is crazy because we're both actively engaged in music and this just falls through the cracks from one of like a very large artists within our current day.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think by itself it's so important that we are able to accept and learn from others, whether that being students that we have to communicate through with them to enhance our teaching for them. And how did we even get to this conversation? We were just talking about the classroom, and we kind of went off, which is great, no, because it's a really important subject.
And
But
yeah, this basically is highlighting the importance of student-centered learning
yeah,
and education and different modalities of learning. And there is
hmm
no one right way
yeah,
to teach and to educate, as long as, I guess when it gets down to it, we have that level of respect all the time, um, and just an acceptance and even an excitement from knowing that we're not done learning as teachers. In fact, we have so much more to learn and we'll always have more to learn. And that's what we want to inspire our students to discover, that they're lifelong learners, not only in music, but in all things.
And I think that's so important that we, like you said, we can't stop learning because we are educators and we have to, like the people that I talked about way earlier, how educators are, they're educators who evolve or learn with the time and try to make it so that their teachings are relative to the time that they're in. And there are also teachers who kind of just stick to their guns and just go, this is how I'm doing it, this is how I've done it, and it's been working, so I'm just gonna keep doing it. And I mean, both sides of the coin, there's nothing wrong with that, but most times, well, most times it's those teachers who interact with you, who try to push that envelope, who try to learn with you,
Mm-hmm.
that are gonna get the most success because students will realize that human element and
Yeah,
that human element of communication that you as a teacher may not know everything and that you are also a learner in progress, just that you're facilitating their learning because you have a extra level of knowledge that you have to give to them, that it creates this like this mutual respect and relationship between you and your
yeah,
students where you can communicate with your students and be able to understand their viewpoints, and then you can evaluate that for yourself and also respect them respectfully, kind of like talk about things. And I think
yeah,
that's so important, especially within the whole 21st century landscape of how things have become, and what we're looking at is that we need to learn how to communicate at all levels. We have to learn how to communicate with others that may not have the same, going into a bit of a political, but
don't have the
talking more,
same ideas and don't have the same values
yeah,
and
and we had
just
to
have a different way of life.
yeah, and we had to learn how to communicate and respect their way of thinking and also talk about our ways. And that in the context of music, we have to respect everybody and we have to be able to communicate back and forth in order to, like we said, progress into a society where we can all be successful in all ways. And this is
Yeah,
for everybody in general. But yeah, and so before we wrap it up, I just wanted to talk about, so our first podcast was about the educator, and now we're talking about the learner. So I
yeah,
kind of would just like to wrap the two episodes together a little bit about how us as educators, like what I'm gonna ask you this question first and then, but as a future music educator and also an educator right now because you are teaching, what are your goals or how do you facilitate your students learning within this context? You can talk about the online format because we're currently in this
oh yeah,
COVID setting, or we can talk about our previous teachings within the classroom.
yeah. Well, I think as far as so engaging students, um, there's a lot of things that go into engaging students. First of all, building the mutual respect, student and teacher relationship of the student knowing that they are cared for as an individual, I think lies at the base of any successful teaching, any successful interaction. Then from there, being able to keep them engaged is huge. Something that is a quote of another teacher is that you know how long you have a student's attention based on their age. So if it's an 8-year-old student, you've got 8 minutes before you have to move to a new topic, which is definitely proven to be true, especially online. Actually, online, you probably have to subtract a few years before you change the subject matter. But keeping them engaged has a lot to do with that level of respect. Then finding ways to motivate them to be interested, giving them enough of a challenge in something where they're willing to try it. Sometimes online, that means they're laying in their bed and you need to figure out how to engage them enough, present them with enough of a challenge where they'll kind of want to try it. For me, that's been playing silly songs and giving them crazy directions like stick your tongue out and turn around in 3 circles and then clap 3 times and sit back down. Uh, but just things to keep them engaged and interested and wanting to learn. Um, so that's a lot of what it's looked like for me right now in my experiences so far. Yeah, it's pretty much all about keeping them engaged and wanting to learn.
Yeah, It's great. Imagine, I could not imagine that student getting up from their computer, sticking their tongue out, spinning around 3 times,
It's
clapping.
actually pretty fun when like they're fourth graders, so like they're too cool right now. They're a little too
Oh,
cool.
they're in that like weird gap where they're
Well,
like
yeah,
kind
they're
of still excited, but like not really. You know?
exactly. But you know, if you just like if you give them enough of a challenge, where it's like, well, I don't know if I could do that, but if we do it faster, then maybe I can prove how great I am at spinning in circles.
It's like, can you? What was the one challenge that people always say? Like, can you like what? Pat your head and rub your stomach at the
Okay.
same time? That was always something that like I didn't never use it in the classroom, but I was like that could be a good way to like facilitate something because it's time and rhythm, you know.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
no, but that's actually that's a really unique perspective because especially we're currently in this online format that you have to be mindful of student time and awareness and engagement. And I love the whole idea that you have to make sure that the students feel cared for because
Yeah.
if they don't feel like they're cared for, they're not going to care about what you have to say. And that
Exactly.
is like the root of everything that we do as educators is how we can get students to come on our boat without forcing them onto it and making them like them come to us being like, hey, we're about to do this cool thing, you want to like blah blah, and trying to get like string them along so that they discover what the
Yeah,
end
like
result is.
I'd love if you'd join us, but if not, that's okay. You can wait over there, but whenever you're ready, you are so welcome.
Yep, and that's like so important, especially in like I'm assuming this is a general music context.
It is.
Yeah, and in general music, you're not focused on this idea that you're teaching kids like the strict rules of music that we have come to accept, but you're trying to get them to interact with music more so than teaching them this is what a quarter note is, this is a sharp,
Right.
this is a flat. You're trying to get them just to listen and engage in music in
Yeah.
some way, shape, or form. And I think what you're doing there is lovely, just because with like the timing and everything, that even them spinning around or like clapping is like
They
that
spin around
all.
on the quarter notes actually is how
Yeah.
it's
But like that, you can facilitate that so that it works into a musical context, but they're doing a physical activity that they're not even thinking about is related to music,
Yeah.
which is super awesome. But how about in the classroom? Like I know that we've taught in classrooms before, but like what are your I'm assuming your goals are still the same. Like you want to engage, you want to care.
It definitely the goals are the same in a classroom. Um, yeah, it all boils down to the same stuff, just kind of different ways of doing it and different ways, like the little things change a little bit. And the classroom management, while is equally as important online as it is in person, sometimes it happens in different ways. A lot of the ways it's the same. If you keep them engaged and keep your pacing up, then they won't have time to get distracted or have
Yep.
time to do things that you don't really want them to do. But you gotta pose questions differently, like, please stay muted until I tell you unmute. Raise your hand if you're ready to unmute
Which is
when you're online, but in person, you can kind of change. Uh, well, first of all, you can make music together at the same time and hear each other, which is a novel idea right now. Um, but you can even change your proximity. Like if a student needs a reminder to focus back in, you can just walk a little closer to them while you're talking to the whole class and that kind of
Mm,
thing. So it presents more challenges there, and your your showing um, of like you caring about them as an individual has to be a different type of. You have to be intentional in a different way online than you do in person. Um, yeah, because a lot of communication is lost when you've got a 2D flat screen in front of
yeah.
you.
I will say the one good thing about having Zoom is that I can remember names because
Yeah.
their names are all in the corner. And from my perspective of that, like from the question that I posed for Michaela, which I'm gonna pose to myself
Yes.
about the learning classroom and how I, as an educator in the field, both pre-service and currently teaching, have like what my goals are. And like Michaela said, this whole idea of getting the connection of like care and making sure that my students feel like the subject that I'm talking to them with or teaching them is in some respect like cared for them, that I care about what they're doing day to day outside of the classroom
Yeah.
because they don't want a teacher who isn't invested in them. And and that investment and respect and communication goes back and forth, that you need that level of mutual respect for one another. And I think the in a classroom in general, my first goal is always to present myself in a way and create a classroom environment which is open for students to talk and, well, not always talk, of course, but open for communication. Like I will might may bring into subjects about how my day went, and then try to bring their day, their conversation to their day, especially nowadays with COVID and everything, that it's that extra mile. Like you have to go the extra mile just to understand, like, hey, so and so is having a rough day.
Mhm.
Just maybe we'll lay back on the energy a little bit, blah blah. And you have to like you have to level out the room, get the feel of like what's happening, what are people going through, what are the things happening within their lives, and just use that as like your basement. Okay, so I'm gonna start it here, and then slowly we'll get everybody on board, and we'll end the
Yeah.
class on a strong note, blah blah blah. And that level of communication is so crucial, especially within just everything that we've talked about, and also the names. I'm really bad with
Names.
names,
Names are
but
so important, and I'm very bad at them too.
but there's nothing worse than your teacher pointing at you and saying blue shirt or like something because you forgot their name. And I myself also hate that, but I'm also a big like I definitely have I haven't pointed at anybody, but I'll be like I'll walk up to somebody and be like, you did blah blah blah. But I'll usually be like, hey, my name is so and so, and like, what's yours? This is primarily just because my only teaching nowadays is primarily in marching band, which is still in person, which is good, well, hopefully good, and we're doing it safely, which is nice. That sometimes a band of 120 people or 120-ish people, I the ability for me as a tech to learn everybody's names and I don't interact with them on a daily basis is really
Yeah.
difficult. So before I even interact with like telling them to fix something that they're doing, either they're playing or with their marching technique, I'm always like, hey, you're doing this very well. You try looking at that. And I'll just like I'll throw in like, hey, what's your name? Just because
Yeah.
I had to be human about it that I don't know everybody's names, and I will try my best to reinforce that name call and calling students by their preferred name
Yeah.
and whatnot, which is really important because that, like we have talked about, this human element that we communicate as people and not at levels. We can't communicate at like I'm teacher, you're student, and
Right.
I can
Yeah.
call you by what you know.
Yeah.
And I think so yeah, my goals are definitely in line with like the whole care and communication aspect before all else. Like you're not going to be able to teach anybody if they feel like they aren't cared for.
Yeah.
And what else? I
And I
guess that
think that would be a great topic for another episode.
yes, we can definitely talk more about into that just because it is this whole idea, this educator of the 21st century and the learner of the 21st century are such grand ideas that one episode cannot really talk about all the different subjects in it. This episode kind of just went through like a quick rundown of what it looks like, what it looked like before, and what it can look like, which is great because we want to we want to get people thinking about what these things look like, what the classroom looks like in the 21st century, what it looked like before, and how it changed from before to now, and then into the future, which I think is really important. But yeah. Do you have any ending notes to any people? Just like a word of advice to music educators who are either in pre-service or maybe in the field right now. I know
Yeah.
that.
I think when we hear 21st century, at least for me, I think technology. Um, but it's not only about technology, and while it's important to utilize the tools that we have access to, whatever they may be, um, teaching, I believe, has always been and will always be about communication and about sharing and about about learning and improving some aspect of our lives by learning more about it and growing more into the people we are meant to be. And that should always be, in my opinion, at the base, and that will always be at the base of how I teach and how I interact with other people. Um, yeah, so no matter what happens with technology and what resources we have, at the core, 21st century learning and learning, I think, indefinitely and teaching is about the students and about what they need and what we can do for them and making sure that they know they are cared about as individuals. How
Yeah.
about you, Jason?
Mine, I could not have summed up those words better than you just have, but I will try to rehash, I guess. But yeah, it's the same idea that well, okay, I'll go on a different route because I agree completely with everything that you just said, but I'll talk about a different piece of advice, and that is just keep learning. Like you never stop learning, or like especially nowadays that we're constantly like it's a lot of educators that I know are learning this new format of Zoom and how to engage in online learning so that it can be successful for the student and for you as the teacher. And there's a as recent months, there's been a bunch of published articles about how to engage with it, different resources, and people on Facebook are sharing, Facebook groups are sharing their resources to others. And I think that's just amazing. Like you can go out there into a community of music educators and of educators in general and just get these resources and get the support that you need to be able to have a functioning online music classroom, which I think is a phrase that none of us want to hear ever again after this. Is that but just be mindful and just look out at what the community is doing, look at how other people are engaging in music, look at what is currently happening in research and how individuals are engaging, and look at resources. Like you aren't in this alone. Like you as the educator are not on an uphill battle by yourself, hopefully not by yourself, climbing this hill trying to teach your students within this new context that we're in, and that resources are out there and trying to learn them, of course, is difficult, but keeping an open mind and trying something new is never gonna hurt. It's hopefully gonna improve and teach you something in your own teaching and hopefully something that you can add into the future of your teaching once we're out of all this. Because the best times to learn are when there are challenges that we've never faced before.
Definitely.
So yeah, before we go, this is a we're gonna do a segment of something that Michaela had recommended.
Yes. So, um, for anybody who does not have the absolute joy of knowing Jason outside of these podcasts, he leads some of the most interesting conversations about you name it, and he could have a conversation about it. And there have been times when we're preparing, especially preparing for this podcast, where he's gone on some interesting routes, talking about the first thing that comes to his mind, which I think we talked about a few months ago, and I suggested he make a podcast just of himself talking about his train of thought, and he should call it Chasin' Jason.
Yes.
Chasin' like running, chasing
Yeah,
Jason.
really confusing because when she first brought it up, I was like, "Are you just saying Jason, Jason?" Because through Zoom I could not hear, and I was like, "I'm not gonna." I was like, "I mean, that'd be kind of interesting if I just called the podcast Jason, Jason," but that doesn't really outline the point. I'm just saying my first name twice, but chasing Jason, chasing.
Jason Jason. So basically, what I think the goal is to happen at the end of each of these podcasts is just to have like a 5 minute episode of Chasing Jason. So, Jason, what's it about today?
Today we're gonna talk about reads.
Oh,
Yes,
related content.
yes, we're gonna relate to music just because as some of you may or may not know, I've been doing a lot of instrumental playing. I've been playing around with secondary instruments that aren't primarily mine. So I've been looking at clarinet, saxophone, and I don't have an oboe, but I would love to do a double reed and continue practicing that. But yeah, this idea. Okay, so where this stemmed from was Harry Potter. In Harry Potter, the wizard or witch, the wand chooses them. Like the idea that like when Harry walked into the wand shop, like he picked up this wand, and then the wand I don't even know the whole context of the of the movie itself. First episode, not episode, first movie. I think it was the Philosopher's Stone. Walks in to get his supplies for Hogwarts because he himself is a wizard. Because Harry, you're a wizard. He goes into the Diagon Alley, goes in the wizard, goes into the wand shop, picks up this wand, which happens to be, spoiler alert, Voldemort's. It's like the same. It's from the same Phoenix, I believe, that Voldemort's wand is from. It's the movie I've watched a long time ago, but like basically he picked up that wand and the wand chose him, and the wand shop owner had brought that up that like that relationship of like person and wand, and when I was choosing my baton, when I first got my like professional baton, that's kind of what happened. I might have been swindled into buying it through the context of the very charismatic salesman. But I picked up this I picked up a wand that had a not a wand, a baton that had a nice base that I enjoyed looking at, and that one that like fit well in my hands, and like because I like conducting with a lot of like a grip around it so I can have more to hold on to so for more control. And I was holding the baton in my hand, just like, feeling it out how it felt. And then the salesman comes up to me and like talks about like how, oh yeah, you played with the baton, it works really well in your hand, blah blah. It's almost like the baton chose you. When you walked up, you saw it, you picked it up, and I was like, wow, he's making a Harry Potter reference. That's awesome. I'm gonna buy this baton. And not saying that it was a bad investment. I use this baton frequently, and it's great, and it works well, and I, you know. But this idea that like the thing chooses you, blah blah, or like you relate to it, and that's your relationship with it. And as wands and batons are primarily wood, I was thinking, well, how about reeds? Like when you get a box of reeds, you open it up, you got like 6 or 7 or 10 of them. You're like looking at it like, do you choose like does the reed choose you or do you choose the reed? And does the reed work? It's a very outlandish idea, but like I was thinking, I had spent like 5, 10 minutes the past week looking at different reeds that I have because I bought like a box, and I was like, how do I know which is right? Do I just like try it? Like, but none of them tried it when they were choosing their wand or batons. They just kind of like they saw it and they're like, "That's the one. That's what I need." And of course, woodwind players will know that there is no like golden rule or no preferred golden rule, and eventually professional woodwind players will make their own reads, and of course, and that matches you. Maybe that's what the maybe the wood chooses you. They find this beautiful piece of like oak wood, like I'm gonna make the best read out of this. But I was just thinking about that because I was like, this read isn't working. Like I'm not able to play, and it might just because I haven't been playing on the read for long enough. And of course, reads settle in the more you play it. But I was looking at it like this box of like 6 and 7 things, and I was like, how great would it be if I just looked at one? It was like, that's the one. That's the one that's gonna make me play alto sax like a king.
And that is Jason.
Yes. So yeah, thank you so much for everybody for listening to both our first episode and our second one. This podcast is going to be on, well, we've been able to put it on Apple Music, Spotify, Buzzsprout, and also YouTube. So whatever medium that you're viewing it through, I want to thank you for the support and leaving comments and, reflecting on music and music education within our 21st century with us today. Michaela, any closing thoughts?
I think you summed it up. Thanks for tuning in.
Yes, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time.